Video games are a hobby, unless you play them in some professional capacity as well, of course, though even then they're likely still a hobby for you outside of that. Hobbies are things that we find enjoyment in, and offer relaxation, escapism, and a community to engage with. Unfortunately, for some, they also offer the opportunity to get riled up at who partakes in the hobby and how they choose to do so. Outside of video games, it's apparent just how ridiculous this sort of gatekeeping nonsense is. Imagine a serene fishing spot overtaken by shouting as one fisher took offence to the way that another chose to engage in the pastime because they were doing it wrong. Or a train spotter who had spent years hiking up a steep hillside to watch the trains go by, crying how soft the hobby had become because there was another train spotting site that was wheelchair accessible. And worse, not everyone using it had a wheelchair. Some just clearly didn't want to put in the grind of a 30-minute sweaty climb for reasons that were entirely their own. Utterly absurd, right? You guessed it, we're talking about accessibility in video games. Star Wars Jedi Survivor has an Arachnophobia mode, allowing players to remove spiders from the game, and a slow mode which allows you to play the game at a lower speed if you wish to. Both of these things are entirely optional for those who may want or need them, and if you don't, then they don't affect you. And honestly, that should be the end of the conversation, because it is in the reverse. I use the whole game permadeath mode on The Last of Us, where my game is entirely reset if I die, and people who would never dream of doing that might think I'm mad, but I'm not aware of them being mad that a mode that they won't use exists. But of course, nobody has any problem with gamers having the option to make it harder for themselves. It's just an obnoxiously vocal minority fuming that others can make things easier for themselves. Whatever the reason, Jedi Survivor's Arachnophobia and slow modes have inspired a lot of ire. They're apparently a sign of modern gamers being wusses, and if we accept these options in games, then soon enough they will become not just options but mandatory, with all games being heavily censored in case people are scared or offended. There was even discourse that those who might use this option should instead face their fears. If someone afraid of snakes enjoys swimming, it would clearly be beyond unhinged to demand that they swim in swamps instead of indoor pools in order to face their fears. It's not much different here. Gaming is a pastime meant for enjoyment and relaxation, not therapy. And honestly, of the person using accessibility options and the person getting mad about them, it's not the person using the options who's most likely to need therapy. The crucial point here is that arachnophobia, or any phobia, is not just being a bit scared. It's an anxiety disorder. Phobias can cause distress, anxiety, and panic attacks. Jedi Survivor is not a horror game, and so it should make immediate sense to give people who don't want to experience these feelings an option other than not playing the game at all. Mind you, even if you enjoy the artificial dread and tension that comes from horror, as I do, that doesn't mean you want to invite panic attacks. A horror game called Spiders, Spiders, Spiders might be one for arachnophobes to straight up avoid. But if you're buying a game whose horror isn't focused on spiders, and an option allows you to avoid the one specific spider encounter, that's hardly unreasonable. It's much the same as the previous discourse about games having trigger warnings and allowing players to skip sensitive content. This too was framed as accommodating wimps, when in fact it's useful for those with post-traumatic stress disorder. Players with PTSD will know their own triggers as well as their own mental robustness in that moment. So yes, it allows them to skip these things if they're not up for it, but equally it allows them to make an informed decision to proceed and view these things if they feel they can handle it. Something you can't do if you have no idea that a subject likely to trigger you is coming up. This explanation still won't satisfy some, however, whose attitude to trauma hasn't evolved past that of a World War I general shooting soldiers with shell shock. But honestly, if your response is still to say triggered in a mocking voice and call people wusses who've been in a situation so horrendous as to cause PTSD, then fuck you. As for the slow mode, this again is an option, and even if the censorship conspiracy theory had any credibility, nobody even in the depths of online comment wars believes that there's a risk of mandatory slow motion in games. But the option will help those whose physical or neurological impairments give them slower reaction times. Or, hell, those who find it helps them through a difficult bit that they can't be arsed struggling with for several hours. And there's nothing wrong with that. Let people play games how they want. It doesn't hurt you. The catch-all response to this, because there's no actual rational reason for getting mad about options, is not all games are for everyone. That's true, but on the basis of taste, not barriers thrown up to you because you have impairments. Impressionist paintings aren't for everyone, but if the gallery hosting them has no step-free access, then you prevent the wheelchair user who loves Impressionism from attending for absolutely no good reason. You might notice that I've talked here about people with impairments and disabled people rather than people with disabilities so far. There's a reason for that. It's because people don't have disabilities. They have impairments and as a result are disabled by barriers in society. Those barriers could be physical and environmental, they could be organisational, they could be rooted in attitudes like those we've been talking about, or they could be information and communication barriers. The thing which disables them and excludes them is not their impairment, but a world that won't accommodate it. This goes for technology and games as well as the physical world, which is why accessible game design is so important. If a player has mobility impairments, then things as simple as ensuring controls can be fully remapped, or allowing a player to replace a held down input with a toggle input, or a repeated button press with a single button press, removes a potential barrier. And that's just one example for one type of impairment. Even options which some gamers dismiss as games playing themselves or for wusses will be something that removes a barrier for a certain kind of impairment. Options to skip puzzles, for example, are equally useful for those with cognitive impairments or blind and visually impaired players, especially in the latter case when the puzzle is an environmental one that navigation assistance cannot adequately handle. But what about people who don't need these options using them? Isn't that cheating? Well, not necessarily, or even if it is, so what? Professional and competitive gameplay has its own rules for this sort of stuff, and I don't know enough on that side of things to comment. But like any competitive endeavour, there were ways to cheat and ways to detect cheating long before accessibility options. As for casual play, there are two things to bear in mind here. One, cheating doesn't really matter if someone is just idly running through a game to unwind and enjoy themselves. It doesn't hurt them and it doesn't hurt you. And two, accessibility options can have benefits that are not cheats beyond what they were intended for, just the same as any emerging gameplay. I'm not hard of hearing, but I find it easier to follow dialogue with subtitles on, especially if I'm also engaging with company at home or talking to chat on stream. Equally, I know every environmental puzzle in both The Last of Us games like the back of my hand, but sometimes I'll skip them if I'm trying to get quicker to other gameplay that I need capture footage of or want to practice, or even if I just can't be bothered. Because, again, play games how you want. The ones who'll scream at you about it are weirdos. What accessible game design does is remove barriers to playing the game for people based on their impairments. What it doesn't do is remove challenge for those who want it. The Last of Us Part 1 and 2 are two of the most accessible games of recent years, and their accessibility options include everything from slow mode, to skipping puzzles, to preventing the enemy AI from flanking you or escaping when you grab them. They also include a difficulty which makes resources absurdly scarce and the enemies scarily alert and intelligent, and removes the HUD so you're never fully sure how much health you have, not to mention the stress-inducing whole game permadeath mode. Removing barriers and improving accessibility doesn't mean shutting out players who want challenge. Increased customization includes them as much as anybody else. The only ones who want to shut out players or place restrictions on what games can do are those rallying so hard against accessibility. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like and consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content. Like the video that just popped up, which YouTube thinks you should watch next. This is a Patreon and member supported channel, so if you want to become a member and unlock custom badges and emojis, early access to my videos, and your name in the credits, then click the join button below. Thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.